Humans, he spat, the word dripping with disdain. A species so fragile that the wind of true war scatters them. They cling to their fleeting lives, scurrying in fear like insects underfoot. They are unworthy of the stars they foolishly claim as their own. The chamber erupted in laughter, the alien delegates basking in the mockery of their absent adversaries. Varkesh paused, savoring the moment, then gestured to the massive hologram behind him. It displayed images of shattered human colonies, their landscapes reduced to smoldering ruins. He turned back to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them with predatory satisfaction. "This is what comes of defiance," he declared. "They begged for mercy as we burned their worlds. And what did their so-called leaders do? They surrendered, sending emissaries who groveled before us. They fear death. They fear war. They are nothing." Unbeknownst to the council, the broadcast of this meeting was being intercepted far from their glittering capital. Deep within a hidden command center on Earth, Admiral Michael Turner leaned forward, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as Varkesh's words echoed through the room. The room was dimly lit, the glow of screens casting shadows on the faces of the gathered military leaders. "Turn it off," Turner commanded, his voice calm but firm. The technician obeyed, and the screen went dark, leaving the room in heavy silence. Turner stood, his towering frame imposing even in stillness. "That bastard thinks he knows us," he said, turning to Commander Brendan Reed, his second-in-command. Reed's jaw tightened, his hands clasped behind his back as he struggled to suppress the anger boiling within. "With all due respect, Admiral, we've been reacting for too long. They need to know what happens when they push us too far." Turner nodded, his expression grim. "Agreed. It's time to remind them who we are." He reached for a secure line and pressed a series of codes. The line crackled for a moment before connecting. "Send him in." The room's tension thickened as the doors hissed open. A man stepped in, his movements unhurried, his presence commanding. John Paul, known to a select few by his code name, Baba Yaga, was a legend whispered among the ranks. He was neither imposing in stature nor adorned with medals, but the air around him seemed to shift, heavy with an unspoken menace. "John," Turner said, his voice carrying an edge of respect and familiarity. "We have a mission." Paul said nothing, his piercing green eyes locking onto Turner's. His silence was an answer in itself. Turner continued, gesturing toward the darkened screen. "The Galactic Council believes humans are cowards, afraid of war, afraid of death. They've killed our people, destroyed our colonies, and mocked our resolve. We need to send a message." Paul tilted his head slightly, the barest flicker of interest palling his otherwise impassive face. "You want a message," he said, his voice low and measured, "or an example?" "Both," Turner replied. "We're sending you to Karath, their military stronghold. Disrupt their operations. Take out their leaders. Make them feel what fear truly is." Reed shifted uncomfortably. "Admiral, with all due respect, this is a suicide mission. Karath is fortified. Their defenses alone are irrelevant," Paul interrupted, his tone cutting through the room like a blade. "They bleed, don't they?" Reed fell silent, his unease evident but unspoken. Turner handed a data pad to Paul, who skimmed its contents with practiced efficiency. It outlined the mission objectives, maps of Karath, and intelligence on key targets. Paul closed the pad and handed it back. "I'll need a ship," he said simply. "It's ready," Turner replied. "You leave tonight." As Paul turned to leave, Reed couldn't contain himself any longer. Why him, Admiral? Why send one man against an entire army? Turner's gaze didn't waver. Because he's not just one man. He's the answer to their arrogance. Later that night, as the stealth ship lifted off from Earth's surface, Paul sat alone in the cockpit, the vast expanse of space stretching out before him. The silence was broken only by the hum of the engines, a sound he found oddly comforting. He glanced at the small photo tucked into the corner of the control panel, a snapshot of a life long gone. His expression softened for a brief moment before the hardness returned. The ship's navigation system chimed, signaling the approach to Karatha's outer orbit. Paul leaned forward, his hands steady on the controls. The mission had begun, and with it, the reckoning humanity had long deferred. As the stealth field enveloped the ship, rendering it invisible to Karatha's scanners, Paul activated the first phase of his plan. He knew the odds, he knew the risks, but he also knew one unshakable truth. Fear wasn't humanity's weakness. It was their weapon. The ship disappeared into the void, a shadow moving toward a world that had yet to understand the price of its hubris. The cold, dark surface of Karath stretched endlessly beneath the stealth ship as it descended through the planet's dense atmosphere. John Paul sat motionless in the cockpit, his sharp gaze fixed on the holographic display projecting the alien compound's layout. The military installation was sprawling, fortified with layers of defensive technology and guarded by an elite force. The Galactic Council's pride and hubris were etched into every inch of its architecture. The ship landed silently in a barren canyon miles from the compound, cloaked from detection. Paul disembarked, his black tactical suit absorbing the dim starlight. The suit's built-in systems hummed quietly, syncing with the compact arsenal he carried. Every step he took upon the rocky terrain was deliberate, his movements blending into the shadows like a predator stalking its prey. As he approached the perimeter, Paul paused, observing the guards patrolling the compound's outer edges. The aliens were disciplined, their movements methodical as they scanned the area with high-tech sensors. But they weren't looking for him. They didn't believe a lone human would dare approach, let alone pose a threat. Paul smirked, his expression devoid of humor. He slipped a small, cylindrical device from his belt and pressed a button. The device emitted a faint pulse, scrambling the sensors within a 100-meter radius. In the same fluid motion, he moved forward, scaling the outer wall with a grappling hook that latched onto the structure without a sound. Within seconds, he was inside. The compound was a maze of corridors and open courtyards, illuminated by an eerie greenish glow from alien light fixtures. Paul moved swiftly, his steps soundless against the metallic flooring. He avoided the main pathways, instead using maintenance tunnels and ventilation shafts to navigate deeper into the facility. Along the way, he planted small, magnetic charges at key structural points, each one armed with a timer synced to his wrist console. He rounded a corner and froze, his instincts screaming a warning. A patrol of 3 aliens approached, their footsteps echoing faintly. Paul pressed himself against the wall, his hand hovering over the knife strapped to his chest. As the aliens passed, he struck. The knife flashed in the dim light, slicing through the first alien's neck with surgical precision. Before the others could react, Paul disarmed and incapacitated them with brutal efficiency. The fight was over in seconds, their bodies crumpling to the floor without a sound. He dragged the bodies into a nearby alcove, wiping his knife clean before continuing. His expression remained unchanged, his focus unbroken. These soldiers weren't the threat. They were pawns in a larger game, a game he intended to end. Reaching the central power hub, Paul paused to assess the situation. The room was vast, its walls lined with glowing conduits that pulsed with energy. 2 guards stood watch near the main console, their weapons at the ready. Paul crouched behind a storage crate, his mind racing through possible approaches. He needed to disable the hub without raising an alarm. From his belt, he retrieved a second device, a compact EMP generator. Setting the timer for 30 seconds, he activated it and slid it upon the floor toward the hub. The device emitted a faint beep as it reached its target, drawing the guards' attention. They exchanged confused glances before one moved to investigate. Paul struck as the EMP detonated, the pulse knocking out the room's power and plunging it into darkness. The guards fumbled with their weapons, disoriented, but it was too late. Paul took them down in rapid succession, his movements fluid and precise. Within moments, the room was silent again, save for the faint hum of emergency systems struggling to reboot. He approached the main console, his eyes scanning the alien script displayed on the screen. Though the language was foreign, its structure was logical, and Paul quickly located the controls for the compound security grid. He input a series of commands, disabling the surveillance systems and locking down the perimeter to prevent reinforcements from arriving. Satisfied, he moved to the next phase of his plan. His wrist console buzzed, alerting him that the charges he'd planted were armed and ready. Paul activated a countdown, giving himself 30 minutes to complete the mission and escape before the entire compound was reduced to rubble. As he made his way toward the command center, the alarms blared. The aliens had discovered the disabled power hub and the bodies he'd left behind. Paul quickened his pace, his mind calculating the best route to his objective. He knew the odds were shifting against him, but he welcomed the challenge. Adversity was a constant companion, one he had long since learned to embrace. He reached the command center, its massive doors guarded by a squad of heavily armed soldiers. Paul observed their movements from the shadows, noting their patterns and vulnerabilities. He placed a hand on the hilt of his knife, his grip firm as he prepared to strike. The first guard fell without a sound, his throat slit before he even realized he was under attack. The others turned, their weapons raised, but Paul was faster. He used their confusion to his advantage, weaving between them with a combination of speed and precision that left no room for error. The fight was brutal, each movement calculated to neutralize his opponents with minimal effort. When the last soldier fell, Paul stepped over their bodies and approached the control terminal. The alien interface glowed faintly, its symbols shifting as he worked to override the system. He uploaded a virus designed to corrupt the compound's network, ensuring their communications and defense systems would remain offline even after the charges detonated. With his objective complete, Paul turned to leave, his senses alert for any sign of pursuit. The halls were eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of alien voices shouting orders. They were searching for him, but they were too late. As he approached the exit, he encountered another patrol. This time, they were ready, their weapons trained on him. Paul dove behind cover as the corridor erupted in a hail of plasma fire. He returned fire with his sidearm, each shot finding its mark. The aliens fell one by one, their superior numbers no match for his skill and resolve. Finally, the last guard fell, and Paul sprinted toward the extraction point. His wrist console buzzed again, the countdown nearing its final moments. He activated his comms, signaling his ship to prepare for departure. The vessel's engines roared to life as he boarded, the doors sealing shut behind him. As the ship ascended, Paul watched from the viewport as the charges detonated. The compound erupted in a series of explosions, flames consuming the structures and sending debris hurtling into the air. The Galactic Council's symbol of power was reduced to ash, its arrogance shattered in an instant. Paul leaned back in his seat, his breathing steady despite the chaos he had just unleashed. He had sent the message, but the mission was far from over. The real battle was only beginning, and he intended to see it through to the end. The destruction of the Koroth compound rippled APOL, the Galactic Council's communication networks, a wave of confusion and disbelief washing over their ranks. General Varkesh stood in the heart of his warship, its bridge alive with activity as officers scrambled to decipher the reports. The screens before him displayed fragmented footage of the attack, guards falling in the dark, explosions consuming the facility, and the shadowy figure responsible slipping away. Varkesh's golden eyes narrowed as he watched the recordings again. "One human," he growled, his voice low and venomous. "One human did this. Is this how far we've fallen?" The officers around him hesitated, their postures tense. They had no answers that would satisfy him. The general's reputation was as unrelenting as his tactics, and his wrath was legendary. Varkesh turned to his second-in-command, Captain Dracker, whose crimson-hued skin seemed to pale under his superior's glare. "Find him," Varkesh ordered. "Send every available scout, every tracker. I want him brought to me, alive or in pieces." Make it clear to the troops. Failure will not be tolerated. Dracker bowed his head and quickly issued commands to the fleet. Within minutes, a network of patrols began sweeping Koratha's surface, scouring the dense jungles and rocky terrain for any sign of the intruder. The alien soldiers moved with military precision, their scanners sweeping the landscape for heat signatures or energy trails. But their quarry was no ordinary opponent. John Paul watched their movements from a ridge, his body camouflaged against the environment. He observed the patrols with a practiced eye, noting their patterns and blind spots. The aliens were thorough, but they didn't understand him. They moved as if hunting a standard target, an enemy bound by fear and survival instincts. Paul was neither. His lips curved into a faint smile as he adjusted the scope of his rifle, lining up a shot on a group of 3 soldiers. A single, muffled crack broke the silence, and one of the aliens dropped, his body crumpling to the ground. The others spun around, shouting in their guttural language, their weapons raised. Paul fired again and another fell. The last soldier panicked, retreating into the jungle, but Paul didn't pursue. He had already moved, vanishing into the undergrowth like a ghost. The alien forces quickly realized they were being hunted. Reports came in of small squads disappearing, their comms cutting out mid-sentence. The survivors described a relentless adversary who struck from nowhere, dismantling their teams with terrifying efficiency. Fear began to spread among the ranks, their confidence eroded by the growing realization that they were not the predators in this scenario. Varkesh seethed as the reports reached him. He slammed a clawed hand onto the command table, the impact sending a shudder through the room. "This is unacceptable," he roared. "Are we to be undone by one man? A mere human?" Dracker hesitated before speaking. "General, he is unlike any human we've encountered. His tactics, his precision, they suggest extensive training and experience." "Perhaps." "Enough!" Varkesh snapped, cutting him off. "He is no more than an animal backed into a corner. And like any animal, he can be caged or killed." Paul, meanwhile, pressed deeper into the jungle, using its dense foliage to his advantage. He studied the terrain, noting natural choke points and areas where he could set traps. His actions were methodical, each step a calculated move in a larger strategy. He wasn't just evading capture. He was drawing the enemy in, shaping the battlefield to his will. In one clearing, he rigged a series of tripwires connected to improvised explosives, concealing them beneath the foliage. In another, he created false trails, leading the patrols into dead ends or areas riddled with natural dangers. Every encounter was designed to sow confusion and fear, to force the aliens to question every step they took. The jungle became a crucible, testing the resolve of both predator and prey. Paul moved with an almost supernatural awareness, his instincts honed by years of surviving impossible odds. He wasn't just fighting to survive. He was dismantling the myth of alien superiority one skirmish at a time. The turning point came when Varkesh, frustrated by the lack of progress, decided to lead the hunt himself. Donning his battle armor, a hulking suit bristling with weapons and defensive systems, he descended to the surface with an elite unit of warriors. His presence was meant to inspire his troops and intimidate his enemy, but Paul viewed it as an opportunity. From a concealed position high above the jungle floor, Paul watched the general's movements through the scope of his rifle. Varkesh moved with purpose, his every step a display of dominance. But Paul saw the vulnerabilities, the gaps in his armor, the overconfidence in his posture. He adjusted his aim, his finger hovering over the trigger, but he didn't fire. Not yet. Instead, he activated a small transmitter, broadcasting his voice APOL the alien comms. "General Varkesh," he said, his tone calm and measured. "You've come all this way for me. I'm flattered." Varkesh froze, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the jungle. "Show yourself, coward," he growled. "Face me if you dare." "Coward?" Paul replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. "You're the one who needs an army to feel safe. But if it's a fight you want, I'll give you one. Just know this. I don't fight fair." The transmission ended, leaving Varkesh seething. He motioned for his troops to fan out, their weapons at the ready. But as they moved, the jungle itself seemed to turn against them. Explosions erupted from hidden mines, and tripwires triggered spikes that impaled those who were unlucky enough to stumble into them. The elite warriors faltered, their formation breaking as panic set in. Amid the chaos, Paul struck. He moved through the confusion like a wraith, picking off soldiers one by one. Varkesh roared in frustration, firing wildly into the shadows, but his shots found only empty air. Finally, Paul emerged, stepping into the open with deliberate calm. He stood a paw from Varkesh, his weapon lowered but his stance ready. The two locked eyes, predator meeting predator. "You think you understand fear," Paul said, his voice low and steady. "But fear isn't what makes us weak. It's what makes us dangerous." Varkesh charged, his armored frame barreling toward Paul like a battering ram. But Paul was ready. He sidestepped the attack, landing a precise shot on one of the weak points he'd identified earlier. Sparks flew as the armor system short-circuited, and Varkesh stumbled, his momentum carrying him into a tree. Before the general could recover, Paul disappeared into the jungle once more, leaving behind only the echo of his voice. "You wanted to fight, General. Now you have won." Varkesh bellowed in rage, his roar shaking the trees. But his confidence had been shaken, and his troops hesitated, their fear palpable. The hunt was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted, and for the first time, the Galactic Empire's greatest general understood what it meant to be hunted. The jungle burned in the distance, thick plumes of smoke rising into the darkened sky as the remnants of Varkesh's forces regrouped near the edge of the battlefield. The once confident soldiers now stood in clusters, their fear barely concealed behind their rigid postures. Their armor was scorched, their numbers halved, and the legend of their invincibility shattered. The whispers among them were barely audible, but the name they feared most carried through the air like a curse: Baba Yaga. General Varkesh stood at the forefront, his massive frame silhouetted against a fiery backdrop. His battle armor bore the scars of countless skirmishes, but it was his pride that had suffered the deepest wound. His golden eyes scanned the jungle, searching for the human specter that had turned his army into prey. His voice, guttural and laced with fury, boomed appalled the battlefield. "Enough of these games, human. Face me." His claws flexed, the servos in his armor whining as he raised his weapon. "Show yourself, or I will raise this jungle until there is nowhere left for you to hide." The response came not in words but in action. From the shadows of the treetops, a single, small explosive tumbled down, landing at the center of the alien formation. The detonation was immediate, the shockwave scattering soldiers like leaves in a storm. The explosion was precise, targeted, designed not to kill but to terrify. The aliens scrambled for cover, their cohesion crumbling. John Paul emerged from the underbrush, his silhouette sharp against the flickering flames. He moved with deliberate purpose, his every step calculated, his rifle slung low at his side. His black tactical suit blended with the ash and shadows, making him appear more phantom than man. The jungle seemed to bend to his presence, the chaos dimming in his wake. Varkesh turned to face him, his lips curling back in a snarl. "So, you finally show yourself. Tell me, human, was it worth it? All this destruction? All these lives lost for a futile fight?" Paul stopped a dozen paces away, his expression unreadable. His green eyes met Varkesh's unflinching, and his voice was calm, almost conversational. "You think this is about me? About some petty revenge? No. This is about you learning a lesson you should have learned long ago." Varkesh barked a laugh, the sound echoing in the smoky air. "And what lesson is that, insect? That you can fight back? That you can bleed us? You're nothing but a pest." Paul tilted his head slightly, his voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous tone. "That humans aren't what you think we are. We don't crumble under fear. We don't break under pressure. When you push us too far, we push back harder. Without another word, Varkesh raised his massive plasma cannon and fired. The blast tore through the air, its energy searing a path straight for Paul. But Paul was already moving, his body a blur as he sidestepped the attack and returned fire. His bullets found their mark, striking weak points in Varkesh's armor with deadly precision. Sparks flew, and the general staggered, growling in frustration. The battle that followed was brutal, a clash of strength against cunning. Varkesh charged with the force of a storm, his strikes powerful enough to shatter trees and scorch the earth. But Paul was relentless, using the jungle to his advantage. He moved with a predator's grace, striking from unexpected angles, each attack designed to chip away at Varkesh's defenses. Their fight spilled into a clearing, the ground scorched and littered with debris. Paul lunged forward, his knife flashing in the firelight as he slashed at a joint in Varkesh's armor. The general roared in pain, swinging his massive arm to knock Paul back. The human hit the ground hard, rolling to his feet just in time to dodge another devastating blow. "You're fast, human," Varkesh snarled, his voice a mix of admiration and rage. "But you're only delaying the inevitable. You can't win." Paul wiped a trickle of blood from his lip, his expression unchanged. "Winning isn't the point," he said, his voice low. "The point is to make you remember this moment, to make you understand that for every world you destroy, for every life you take, there will always be someone like me waiting for you." Varkesh roared and charged again, but this time Paul didn't retreat. He moved forward, his movements precise, his strikes calculated. He dodged the general's attacks with inches to spare, his counterattacks relentless. He was no longer just a soldier or an assassin. He was the embodiment of humanity's resolve. The climax came in a single, decisive moment. Varkesh overextended, his frustration driving him to reckless aggression. Paul seized the opening, driving his knife into the exposed circuitry beneath the general's arm. Sparks erupted, and Varkesh bellowed in agony, his armor locking up as its systems failed. Paul stepped back, breathing hard but steady. He watched as Varkesh struggled, the once mighty general now brought low. For a moment, the jungle was silent, the flames casting long shadows over the scene. "You think you've won," Varkesh rasped, his voice thick with pain. "But there are more like me, more armies. You can't stop us." Paul knelt, his face close to the general's as he spoke with quiet intensity. "Maybe not, but I don't need to stop all of you. Just enough to make the rest think twice." He rose, turning away as Varkesh collapsed, his strength finally failing him. Paul activated his wrist console, signaling his ship. It descended from the clouds moments later, its engines kicking up ash and debris as it landed in the clearing. As he boarded, he cast one last glance at the jungle. The mission was over, but the message had been sent. Humanity was no longer a species to be underestimated. They were a force that could not be broken, no matter how hard the galaxy tried. The ship ascended, leaving the burning jungle behind. In the silence of the cockpit, Paul allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He had done what needed to be done, and now the galaxy knew the truth. Fear wasn't humanity's weakness. It was their weapon,